everybody. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers of the conference for inviting me here and sharing my ideas on humanitarian migrant integration in Europe in general. And I'm happy that in this setup, we are able to speak about a very positive experience of integrating Ukrainian displaced population in Europe. This is not the first time Europe is receiving a huge inflow of refugees. And actually, Ukraine was not the only country of origin from where people were seeking for protection, even from the start of the war in Ukraine. Despite the unfolding crisis on the east, the EU had been receiving the highest number of asylum applications from 2017 to 21. It was much more than the average we were observing from the previous years. And the Venezuelans, Syrians and Afghans were a significant part of this humanitarian flow. This is to say that the fact that the Ukrainian conflict was unfolding didn't cancel all the flows that were coming to Europe from other more traditional conflict-engaged regions. However, of course, the Ukrainian crisis put a lot of pressure on the asylum system of European Union, and we learned a lot from also previous conflicts and previous humanitarian refugees, humanitarian migrants. What were the main obstacles of integrating them in our society from the point of view of education, social integration, and labor market participation? And there is a reason why we care so much about their labor market integration. Because, first of all, from the figures that we have from the past, humanitarian migrants are constantly perform worse in the labor market compared to other group of migrants. For example, those who come for work or study purposes. And they perform worse compared to native, which is normal. However, they also perform worse compared to other group of migrants. And this gap, while recovering over time, remain persistent. So there is a question on the policymakers' tables how to make sure that humanitarian migrants quickly integrate in the labor market of destination countries. During the last crisis that Europe faced, it was 2016-17 crisis in the Middle East, in Syria, there was a big concern among policymakers how to make sure that we don't delay the migrant integration and don't create the population is not integrated in the society and remaining aside dependent on benefits that are receiving from the government. And actually this was the opportunity. Then in 2016 we at the Migration Policy Center at European University Institute conducted a study in which we tried to understand what are the key factors that are facilitating labor market integration of humanitarian migrants. We call them humanitarian migrants because most of them were not granted refugee status immediately, so they were asylum seekers for a while. And the purpose of this was to, first of all, map the existing measures across EU member states, the most important receivers of these humanitarian flows, and also to understand the existing practices, challenges that are facing the policymakers while trying to integrate them in the labor market, and also try to understand the contextual factors that are affecting the effectiveness of measures, because despite the relatively harmonized approach to refugee integration, we would see very different outcomes in different countries. And the countries that we picked were the 9 countries that were Austria, Denmark, France, Germany, Italy, Netherlands, Spain, Sweden, and UK, then still member state of European Union. What we found out is that first of all, there were a lot of measures existing already. However, there was not much systematic analysis on the effectiveness and efficiency of these measures for different reasons, because it's very hard to conclude whether the outcome of migrant integration was a result of time passing or they were a result of the measures implemented, because it's very difficult to build the counterfactual. What would be if we wouldn't put in place any measures? You cannot split the refugee population into two and apply some measures to one, then not to apply to others. This is beyond the ethical consideration that we can handle, despite the research curiosity. There were some studies existing, especially in Scandinavian countries that had a longer history of integrating refugees, but also in Canada, where they had a very well-established program of financing or resettling refugees from different countries. There were, parallel to us, OECD study conducted, and they came up with 10 lessons about migrant integration in the destination countries, which the results were pretty much in line with our own ones. And when we were mapping the labor market integration measures, we of course tried to be as wide as possible and looked both on skill and need assessment, the skill development, including language courses, but not only, like recognition of qualification, VET programs, and job intermediation, the function that was overburdening the public employment services at those time. The recognition of skills and qualification, that was the previous speakers of mine were mentioning the overqualification present also in Estonia among Ukrainian population, and incentives for economic integration, because very frequently there were public money put to incentivize employment, but these programs wouldn't work beyond the conclusion of the projects. We identified 94 measures across these countries, which provided a quite wide range of activities through which we could draw some lessons. Of course, I wouldn't go into details about those. However, despite our efforts, there was not much information then available to assess the effectiveness of these policies. What we could understand is that what were the main factors that were hindering the integration or policy effectiveness, but also factors that would help making these policies and interventions more effective. It was very clear that public employment services, together with the asylum system, were overburdened across European countries. They had some constraint, the number of employees they had, and they couldn't handle with hundreds and thousands of newcomers and difficult newcomers. They were not the native ones that were more easy to consult and put into employment. Then also, it was very difficult for public employment services to provide a customer job counseling. It was one of the key aspects that facilitates the employment of a person to find a job that meets the aspiration of the person. However, when you would go and ask the public employment service officer how much time there was dedicated with a concrete refugee to speak about the beyond the linguistic barriers, also to speak about what were the preferences, past experience, etc., we measured that there was less than 1 minute spent overall on this kind of thing. So one thing is on the paper, we recommend to have customized approach. On the other hand, the constraint that public employment services have. Then the second one, that there was not much information available. Indeed, despite the measures, it was very difficult to find in a documented way who were the people that were beneficiaries of these programs, and there was no also proper follow-up. So you would know how many people passed through these programs, but little would be known about their characteristics, and there were almost no follow-up. So one of the big recommendations, of course, was the more data, more follow-up, and more research needed. Okay, if we want to know what works, what doesn't, we need to also understand. We need to collect documented. Actually, Germany had a very good experience within IAB. Sorry, I don't know how it opens, but it's a research center within their employment ministry. And they had a follow-up studies of Syrian refugees, trying to understand their characteristics and how policies affected their outcome later. Now, What we also understood is that there is a big challenge about the legal status, the uncertainty of the refugees and asylum seekers. They don't know whether they will have finally the opportunity to stay in the country or not, and whether it makes sense to learn the language and to look for an employment. Also, it was clear that the sooner are the policy interventions, the better. Why? Despite being costly, the cost of not integration was too high. So we are speaking about the cost of integration, but it's very important to understand what is the cost of non-integration. Non-integration means not being the part of the society, being constantly dependent on the public funds, which is not cheaper in the long term. Then finally, it is also very important to understand that while the public employment services often offer whatever the courses and instruments they have in place, this is not always fitting the characteristics of the refugee population or the asylum seekers. So there is a need to adapt them to the population that they were addressing. Most often it is not the demand-driven but supply-driven. So they are offered what is in place. Finally, it was clear that there was a very good experience from connecting the practical work to vocational education. So not to organize courses that are detached from the employment, but try to make sure, first of all, that the private sector is involved, to give a more lasting effect to the employment opportunities and subsidized employment put in place, but also to make sure that the education process, the VET, the trainings that are organized are not in the classroom only, but they have an opportunity to have a contact with employees and with the real job place. Finally, and not less importantly, that often the case, the policies are connected to the dispersal policies in the housing market. So humanitarian migrants are often tried to put in places that are suffering from the population, or there is more maybe housing opportunities available. But that does not mean that there are also labor market opportunities in place. So we shouldn't prioritize housing market condition to the one of the labor, because then we might have them locked in places that are offering little possibilities. I would like to, in the second part of my presentation, I would like to speak why the experience we had with other refugees is different compared to the Ukrainian one. Because, first of all, EU has received the highest share of people fleeing from Ukraine, but also this was due to geographic proximity, the historic ties, the political position the EU takes towards the war, the conflict, and the asylum system had to deal with a volume of movement that was unprecedented. So that would create a huge burden on asylum system. So what has been done? There was EU activated first time, despite being created in 2001, the Temporary Protection Directive. So the tool that was designed to levy the pressure on the asylum seekers in times of unmanageable burden on EU member states. So to support the Temporary Protection Directive, European Commission established the Solidarity Platform Ukraine. And despite working for 20 years for different institutions and on migration, this is the first time we saw such a quick response and such a coordinated response. Moreover, working in the Commission previously, I can say that we have been in a task force that every week we had a meeting and we were communicating and redefining our objective and next steps in response. There was a EU blueprint network that is a network on data collection, and in this case, the data collection on Ukrainian displacement and responses was not done on a regular basis. It was done whenever the new piece of data was coming. Okay, so that was also coordinating the data collection and responses, not only from national authorities at EU level, from Frontex, but also from IOM and UNHCR, also Moldova and Ukraine were involved in the data collection and dissemination process. So the beneficiaries of temporary protection, there were many, of course, and their distribution was varied significantly across member states. Some of them experienced the first wave of inflow, which were the neighboring countries, but then the other countries on the west slowly were also receiving huge number of asylum seekers. The size of the population is important factor in understanding how many humanitarian migrant country can receive. We cannot compare Estonia with Germany, not only in terms of population, but also in terms of GDP. So it was important also to understand the relative figures. And in this sense, for example, Estonia was one of the most important countries per capita receiving the number of refugees. So then we have seen that the temporary protection over time has evolving, but most of the flow was coming on the first 2 quarters since the war, and then the flows was propagating to the west, but not so many new refugees, not so many displaced population were coming in. But that was also important to acknowledge that the inflow of Ukrainian citizens to Europe was not something new. Already before the war, there was a big community of Ukrainian origin residing in EU member states, obviously not equally distributed across member states. However, for example, Poland, Italy, Spain, Germany were receiving a huge number of Ukrainians already before. And this also helped us to understand initially before the data was coming where they would go, because we knew that they first entered to neighboring countries, but we knew for sure that they would come also to Italy and to Spain, where they had already the established community. And here I would like to just show that the correlation between the temporary protection issued and also the number of previously residing population. So there is a huge correlation between these two numbers. We'd also tried to anticipate this before the data was coming. And what we did is actually we looked at the innovative data, non-traditional data, and this case was the Facebook connections. And we realized that Facebook connections pretty well predict the destination of refugees where they would go. This is social connectedness index, which doesn't reflect necessarily Ukrainian people residing, but there's some friendship connections through Facebook. And that actually we could pretty precisely, because we knew at the region level the size of the connection, also to predict within countries where they would go. For example, in Italy it would be Milan, Naples, Rome. Okay, in Portugal it was Porto and some other cities. So we could also know which would be the magnet cities. Finally, I would like to bring the third reason why the case of Ukrainian is different, is because the profile, the human capital profile of Ukrainian is very different compared to the previous flows. Actually, there are very different estimates of the share of the highly educated Ukrainians, because they are not completely comparable with the EU ones, but the share of Ukrainians with tertiary education is way higher than the EU average. It is, through some estimates, it's even higher than in Poland, but overall it's well-educated population, especially among women. The tertiary education rate is higher than among men, and we know that the majority of those who came to EU were actually women. There are also estimates, non-representative samples, but try to understand what is the share of tertiary educated one in different samples through different programs. And in UK, in some cases, it was more than 80% of people having tertiary education. So this means that there is a huge potential, because we have to acknowledge that in the previous waves of migrants, of humanitarian migrants, one of the challenges of integration was the lack of formal education. There was not much to recognize or to build up on. Finally, it's also important to acknowledge that most of the Ukrainians coming to European Union were coming for remunerated activities. So they were already involved in activities in the labor market, which would help them also to get into their compatriots that were arriving. So you see 77% of those who were coming to Poland were for employment activities. Similarly, also in Italy, 64%. And in another piece of research years ago that we tried to understand the integration level of different origin groups in different European countries. We tried to understand through a set of Zaragoza indicators which origin destination corridors are better integrated in the labor market, education, and access to citizenship. And Ukrainian, actually, that we observed in Italy, because this was the big sample that we could estimate, they were the best ones among all the corridors we considered. So compared also benchmark to native employment rate and the unemployment rate and earnings, we could see that Ukrainians were the best ones among the groups that we considered. Finally, there was also the political, of course, commitment from the European Commission to make sure that Ukrainians are integrated, and the EU Talent Pool initiatives, which was one of the main deliverables on the new Pact on Migration, was actually refurbished into something that would be piloted on Ukrainian displaced population. Actually, the whole tool was designed to be piloted on the population that was already residing in the EU, and they were trying to get them in touch through EURES portal with thousands of employees across Europe. So this is not something small. That was something that was not aimed to be towards Ukrainians specifically, but it was piloted towards Ukrainian population. Oops. Sorry, finally, and this is a very important point why Ukrainian integration in European society is different and will be different, is that the public opinion surveys has demonstrated that there was a huge support towards Ukrainian population. And I try to bring parallels between my experience with Syrian refugees in Armenia, where I studied their experience, unlike European context where people were coming through smuggling networks, crossing the sea, paying everything to reach safety. In case of Armenia, the ethnic minorities of Armenians from Syria were transported by normal means, granting them immediately temporary protection, etc. And within a year, their employment rates were in line with the ones that were of native population. So the solidarity and the welcome makes a lot of difference. The Eurobarometer flash that this was dedicated to to the conflict in Ukraine has demonstrated that the majority of Europeans think that since the war started, EU has shown solidarity, the 79%, and has been united. That was a very also important moment of consolidating the efforts of different countries. It was also fast in its reaction. 88% of Europeans approved the idea of welcoming the EU people fleeing the war. 80% approved the financial support, 66% think that Ukraine should join EU when it's ready, and 71% believe that Ukraine is part of the European families. About 90% feel sympathy towards Ukraine. This is to say that not only the measures were unprecedented, but also the solidarity and support that would make a lot of difference when you are thinking about future integration prospects in the country. I will finish here and would be available for the further question and discussion.
Thank you, Sona. Thank you for this very thorough presentation. We will now take questions from the audience. Does anyone have any questions? No? I will then ask. So as we know, the European Union is facing labor shortages in very strategic sectors, and also the population is aging. So would it be wise for the European Union to strategically integrate those refugees to those sectors, and how the Ukrainian population may differ?
Yeah, first of all, disclaimer, I'm not speaking on behalf of the European Commission, just to make sure. However, maybe this is the fifth reason why the Ukrainian case is different. I just didn't want to put on slides. But I would like to say that we have to think that Ukraine is next member state of the European Union, and Ukraine itself has been heavily affected by the aging population and migration. Already before the war started, that there were the prospects of Ukrainian population were not bright. So the war brought to more migration and more displacement. There were also, of course, losses during the war. We don't know how long the war will last, but what we have to keep in mind is that, first of all, we should try to make sure that they are as integrated as possible, but they are also have prospects to return back to their country to rebuild, because Ukraine, that is lacking heavily human resources to rebuild, is a huge threat for the security of the European Union in general. We have also to keep in mind that, of course, we don't know what will happen next. We try to, in one of the research papers that we wrote for the post-war recovery, we try to estimate the population that would return. It's not easy, and we don't know in which direction the population movement will be after the war, because the war is one of the reasons of population moving, but there is also income differences that were there, and that was the reason Ukrainians were migrating also before war, and I don't think that there will be an easy fix after. We should also remember that most of people who came, they were splitted families. Their husbands are fighting back home, and we don't know family unification in which direction will take place. Whether these two families will join their husbands back home, or that will be husbands who are coming, and we have to take into account that this population will be heavily traumatized, most probably with some kind of health serious issues, and we have to strategically think how to make sure that whatever is scenario, the contingent plan, we are ready to accept them, but also to have the support for all these family unification processes. Yes, the Ukrainian population can fill this gap that we are having in certain sectors, but I don't think that we should think of Ukrainian population as a fix for demographic problems in European Union.
Thank you.